You're listening to episode 180 of Mid-America Reformed Seminary's Roundtable podcast. In this broadcast, the faculty of Mid-America discuss theology and cultural issues from a Reformed perspective. I'm Jared Luchbor, serve as the Director of Marketing here at the seminary. Thank you for tuning in. In today's episode, I'm joined one last time by Dr. Alan Strange in this segment of Ancient Church History. Dr. Strange, how are you doing today?
Jared, I am doing very well. I'm thankful to be on here with our listeners. Let me just say, I really do appreciate all of our listeners. We pray for you all. We pray for God's blessing upon you and your lives and your ministries and all that the Lord has called you to do and how He has gifted you. We're thankful for that. We're thankful for your support of us here. It means really more than we can say, and we'd be remiss not to mention it. And so I do want to mention it again. And I know many of you have even prayed personally. Some of you know that my wife has had health problems, serious ones, and she's doing well now, and we're really grateful for so many people. When I was talking to her recently, I said, I'm so thankful, and she said, it's the prayers of the saints. That's what God uses. She said, people have been praying for me all over the world, and I really think God blesses that, and He does. So we pray for you. Keep praying for us.
Yes, thank you for sharing that, Dr. Strange. Today you're going to elaborate a little bit on the regular and the secular clergy. What can you tell us about that in the context of the early church?
Yeah, Jared, that's this isn't something that's just in the chronology, so to speak, that we've kind of been loosely following, but we speak of, and it may seem like a rather odd way of speaking to many of our listeners if you've never heard this particular nomenclature or way of titling something, to speak about the secular clergy. I thought clergy were in some way religious or something. How could they be secular? Secular is from the word saecula, meaning in the world. So the Roman Catholic Church comes to call, they don't really come to use this language until quite a bit later, but they come to call the clergy that you often think of as just the clergy, the parish priest, or maybe there's a monsignor there, and then there's an auxiliary bishop and an archbishop, all the way up to the Bishop of Rome. In other words, the sort of graded hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church. That's referred to as the secular clergy because they are carrying out the mission of the church in the world. Whereas the regular clergy, that interesting language, has to do with the clergy who live regula, that's the word, the Latin word, according to the rule. According to the rule. And so the Benedictine rules and other rules that are for those and govern those who are in cloistered life, the life of the monastery. And so you could say the secular clergy are the regular parish priests and so forth, and the regular clergy are the monks and the nuns in the monastery. And in terms of the secular clergy, we could talk about a little bit about the rise of the papacy. Now, that's something, the papacy as an institution, which is to say the Bishop of Rome and his office and how it develops, is something much more appropriately spoken of in the medieval church in detail. But I just want to alert you to the fact that you can see the beginnings of it in the ancient church. It's not as early as many historians of the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, they say it starts with Peter and it's this unending line from there. It's quite a bit more complicated than that. There are three scriptural considerations that Rome particularly has and bases its claim to primacy and its claim to being successors of Peter on. And that's Matthew 16, you're Peter, on this rock I'll build my church. I think most of our listeners know that. 16, 18, and 19. Luke 22, 31 and 32, where Jesus said to Peter that Satan has demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat, but I've prayed for you that your faith doesn't fail, and when you've turned again, strengthen your brothers. That's a second passage that's seen as affirming or establishing Peter's primacy in the church. And then John 21, where the fallen Peter, right? Peter does deny Jesus. He weeps bitterly, and Jesus publicly restores him. And he says, do you love me? 3 times. and he says, feed my lambs, feed my sheep. And so many would say, well, here's a biblical warrant for the primacy of Peter. We're going to see as we go along that those scriptures do not show that Peter has some particular warrant, and that Rome, that those who are in the seat of the Bishop of Rome are actually his successors. Even if Peter does have a place of particular honor, the notion that the bishops of Rome are his successors is highly contested in any case. But Rome also claims that Saints Peter and Paul founded the church in Rome, and Peter was given the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And you can talk about 2nd and 3rd century development in this a little bit. Victor, the Bishop of Rome, around 190-200, rebuked the churches of Asia Minor for not following the date for Easter that the Roman church followed. That's called the so-called Quartodecimon controversy. I'm sure you wanted to hear about that. Stephen, in his controversy with Cyprian, that's in the mid-3rd century, around 250, explicitly for the first known time claimed to stand on what he called the Petrine deposit of faith. He's saying, I stand on Peter and his authority. And he claims supremacy over the churches of North Africa. And Cyprian earlier seemed to yield to that, and then in the second edition of his work on the church, he took issue with it, mainly because he had come to have disagreements with Stephen. The 4th and 5th century sees developments. You heard me read from the tome of Leo last time. And Leo the Great, 440 to 61, really exercises a lot of power. But there's more that we could say. The early medieval papacy begins with Gregory the Great. He was pope from 590 to 604. And some of you may know that Calvin actually regards him as a good churchman. He's quite appreciative of Gregory. So it is the case that whatever problems bishops of Rome may have had in the ancient church, they don't really start to have the kind of problems that become marked and call for reformation into the medieval church.
So you have the regular and the secular clergy, you have the papacy here. How does monasticism come to be in the early church?
Yeah, monasticism is a fascinating question. There's a lot of discussion about its origins. Some scholars think that monasticism was prompted by late Jewish communal and ascetic ideals, like the Essenes. The Essenes in the Dead Sea cult, are they, the Qumran community, are they sort of early monastics? Some argue that. Others speculate even that Manichaean dualism or Gnosticism in its various forms inspired extremes of asceticism within Christianity. So there were these extremes of asceticism would be extreme denial of the flesh, so starving yourself and beating yourself and all these sorts of extreme acts of self-denial, that there were pockets of that. Paul seems to address potentially some of that. He seems to address in, say, his letters to the Corinthians, the possibilities on the one hand of an ascetic extreme, or on the other of a libertarianism where you figure, well, the body doesn't matter. A lot of this could come from a kind of Platonism. In other words, the body doesn't matter, so you do one of two things with it. Either you beat it and you starve it and all that because it doesn't matter, or because it doesn't matter, you just live as you please. As Paul says, eat, drink, and be merry. He said that's the result if there's no resurrection. And those Platonists said there's no resurrection because you get rid of the body. You don't want the body. So Paul had to deal with some of these things. And this could have influenced. Others point to gospel origins in Jesus and Paul for this. It is the case, we should point this out to our listeners, just they'll know it immediately when I point it out, but it's easy to forget, that other religions have monastics. So whatever the impulse is, you can look at Eastern religions. You can think of Buddhist monks, right? You can think of the Dalai Lama, who, when you think of Nepal and Tibet and the religion there, this is all monasticism of a sort. It's a separated, cloistered life. In terms then of the earliest forms, some think that the first nuns may have come out of widows of the later Roman period who decided not to remarry, these people who served diaconally. Obviously, there's a lot of debate about all that. The Desert Fathers, they lived as hermits in the deserts of Egypt, Syria, and Palestine, leaving the towns to engage in a solitary struggle against temptation. And so a lot of the earlier monastics were what's called anchoritic monasticism or isolated monasticism. It was you sort of on your own, and that develops into kenobitic or common life monasticism, whence the cloister and all that emerges, where it's a community that's living together. And among those earlier ones, you have somebody who are rather curious. You have somebody like at the end of the 4th century, Simeon Stylites. Simeon Stylites was a so-called pillar dweller. He spent 37 years on a small platform atop a pillar near Aleppo, which is in modern Syria. And people would come to him and ask him questions. Some have posited that he did this to kind of get away, and he became such an object of attention that people were coming to ask him. And there's some debate about whether he was kind of grouchy about all these people coming to see him. You know, it's like, I'm trying to be alone. But I'll say this, Jared. I think we could say that Christianity particularly developed what we could call a regular clerical order after the end of the faith being regarded as illicit. Because here's what happened. We can think of it in more current times as, say, a youth leader in a church getting the kids fired up because they're interested in being, as he's encouraged them to be, radical Christians. Or you could just go back to what I grew up with, or some of the dispensationalism, the language of what you get at Moody or the old Unshackled radio program. You become a Christian, or like in the Billy Graham films, and you go into full-time Christian service. In other words, if you're really a Christian, you're going to be sold out for Jesus in this way. You're going to be an evangelist, or whatever the case may be. I think you've always had in Christianity the impulse of radical Christianity. You've always had those who want to be the most committed and sold out for Jesus. I'm just trying to put it in terms that our listeners could really understand. And so you go back to this in the earliest church, and the people who sometimes were most expressive of this were the people under persecution and who took real strong and clear stands and were martyrs for the faith. But when those persecutions end with the conversion of Constantine in 312 and the issuance of the Edict of Milan in 313, and Christianity goes from being illegal and under the sword to legal, and then it becomes later the law, everybody has to be one, that dynamic is gone, that dynamic of persecution. And now Christianity is sort of an accepted thing. It's even a required thing. What do you take and what do you do with that dynamic? And I think a lot of that goes into monasticism and into the development of monasticism. And so we're going to see that a lot more in the Middle Ages. But what you're going to really see in the Middle Ages, you're going to see, as we began this conversation, as you raised the question of tell us about the secular and the religious clergy, or regular clergy. They sometimes call them the religious, those who are in the orders. What happens in both of those in the Middle Ages, just to look forward a little bit to the Middle Ages, is there's such a misunderstanding about the Christian faith. The conviction comes to be in the church that your average Joe in the pew, right? So your average pew sitter is not really going to live out the Christian faith. Not only in a radical way, he's not going to live it out, but he's not necessarily going to really live it out in a clearly recognizable way. And they would look at something like the Roman Catholic Church comes to look at something like, say, the Sermon on the Mount. And they say, well, who does that? The people in the monastery. And they're living it out for you. So think how it goes. Mass, or the receiving of the sacrament of the Eucharist, becomes really the clergy there administering it. And a lot of the congregation is excluded from it. This happens in the Middle Ages. Similarly, you have this conviction that the people that are most living out the Christian life are your monastics, or the secular clergy. So the regular clergy, the monastics, come to be viewed kind of as first-class Christians. The secular clergy, or the parish priests, come to be the second-class Christians. And the regular Joe pew sitter becomes the third-class Christian. And you can see this is part of what goes into making the need for reformation and for a better understanding of how we're saved. But so these views of clergy come to really, the clergy comes to be the church in the Middle Ages. It comes to be identified as the church. So you would identify the church by its priests, by its monks, and, Joe Christian really gets shoved to the side and marginalized.
And that concludes our segment on early church history. We hope you've enjoyed diving into the world of Augustine and some of the early church councils and the formation of the early church. We're going to be taking a break over the rest of June to prepare for upcoming episodes, but don't worry, you can still tune in to our older podcasts and revisit some of your favorite episodes at midamerica.edu/podcasts or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Our faculty have covered a wide range of topics, so feel free to explore our archive and continue learning with us. We'll be back with new episodes on the first Thursday of July, where we'll continue to explore fascinating subjects and dive headlong into the Reformed faith. I'm Jared Luchabor. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next month.